To begin, at long last, to do more, to go further, men have begun to go down to the sea, not to cross it, not to play within it, but to dwell, to live for a while.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to explore the topic, can humans live at the bottom of the ocean? And though this topic seems a bit different than some of the space and physics content that I've done previously, it's actually sort of related to the last video I did about Michio Kaku's book, The Future of Humanity, where he talks about the search and need for a second Earth. But instead of a second Earth, this one is more of a second home on the first Earth, this one being underwater. But there are a lot of pluses to humans living underwater as opposed to a different planet. Of course, there's a lot of room down there since the oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface, and the oceans are a lot closer than, say, Mars, and it's an all-around cheaper prospect to set up shop down there as opposed to going to space. And also, in the let's just see what's out there kind of vein, 80% of our oceans are unmapped, unobserved, and unexplored, according to NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. It reminds me of those old Explorer maps where there's just like big chunks of continents missing because they had no idea that anything was there. I mean, shouldn't we know what's down there? But back to, can human beings live at the bottom of the ocean? In the 1960s, a doctor from Ohio named George Bond would not only ask this question, but lead 3 different expeditions in order to answer it. And unfortunately, not all of those expeditions would end well. Dr. George Bond was a physician in private practice who entered the Navy in 1953 at the end of the Korean War. In 1957, he was assigned to the Medical Research Laboratory at the U.S. Naval Submarine Base in New London, Connecticut. This lab was the center for studying the effects of diving on the human body. The Navy was researching how men could potentially escape from a submarine, if necessary, and at what depths. And the big question that arose at the time was, how deep and how long could a human being stay underwater? And at the time, nobody really knew the answer to that. Diving, as we know it today, begins in the 1920s, with hard hat divers sporting this sweet look and breathing through air pumped through hoses from the surface. However, these umbilical lines could easily become compromised by obstructions or folds, making them pretty dangerous. Eventually, the use of pressurized vessels would become more commonly used to get to the bottom of the ocean. Rudimentary submarines had been used as far back as the Civil War, with the H.L. Hunley and its success in sinking the USS Housatonic in 1864. However, in the 1920s, submarines could only really descend to about 350 feet and had no windows, so once you got down there, you couldn't really see your environment. In the 1930s, the bathysphere, a spherical deep-sea submersible with a couple of windows made of 3-inch fused quartz, would go down over 2,500 feet, nearly half a mile, and observe for the first time the strange life forms that live in the deep sea. By 1953, the Trieste, a Swiss-Italian research vessel, made history by going down over 35,000 feet into the infamous Marion Trench in the Pacific Ocean and staying down there for 20 minutes. And just for a little comparison, these guys were deeper underwater than the height of Mount Everest in 1953, and they held that record until 2012. So there were a lot of exciting things going on in the world of underwater exploration by the time Bond arrives at the U.S. Naval Submarine Base about 4 years after the Mariana Trench dive. But the one thing that all of these great advances had in common is that the people going down to these depths never left their submersible. They were in airtight containers and could not swim around freely underwater, coming and going as they pleased. By the 1950s, nuclear power allowed for submarines to be underwater weeks at a time, but again, no one was really leaving the submarine underwater to go for a quick swim. By the 1940s, scuba divers could dive underwater, but were very limited as to depths because they had compressed air on their backs. So the further down they went, the more dangerous it was because of the buildup of pressure, something that we all experience whenever we dive down to the bottom of a very deep pool. This pressure is measured in units called atmospheres. And basically, sea level is 1 atmosphere. And when you dive beneath sea level, every 33 feet of descent, the atmospheres double, and the air that you are breathing becomes compressed. The further down you go, the more the air molecules in your lungs, which are comprised of 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen, become concentrated. And under this concentration, the molecules are absorbed into the bloodstream and body tissues. But too much oxygen into our system becomes toxic and causes convulsions. Too much nitrogen can cause a woozy fog that is also deadly. But the weight of all of the water above you keeps those gases compressed and doesn't cause you harm. But when you return to the surface, that compression goes away, and the gases need time to diffuse out slowly. Not getting that time is what causes the bends, or decompression sickness. So Bond's theory was that at a certain pressure, the human body was as saturated with nitrogen and oxygen as it can possibly be. So divers could basically stay down there indefinitely, provided they get one long decompression at the end. Essentially, the decompression time is the same, whether you're down there for 1 day or 100 days. And this theory became known as saturation diving. And if it was true, the idea of humans living underwater suddenly became a lot easier. Bond submitted a proposal to study people living underwater, building houses, farming, and initially the Navy only seemed moderately interested. But in April of 1961, the USS Thresher, a submarine, was lost with all hands aboard, and George Bond's deep-sea diving research suddenly took on a much higher priority for the Navy. In 1962, he started the Genesis project and built the first pressurized container to test. He cranked up the pressure as if the container was 100 feet underwater and started experimenting with different mixtures of air that would be pumped into the container for the divers. He included nitrogen and oxygen, of course, but also included helium, which would offset that woozy fog from too much nitrogen. The success of this experiment led to more testing, including a final test where 3 team members lived in the Genesis container for 2 weeks at the same pressure found at 200 feet. And aside from some communication issues with the Genesis, the experiments were a success. Bond concluded his experiments with Genesis, saying that as a result of some 6 years of animal and human studies involving closed ecological systems, elevated pressures, and synthetic atmospheres, the stage has been set for operational application of the work. It would now appear that we can safely station men at any point on the submerged continental shelf with a reasonable expectancy of useful performance for prolonged periods of time. Bond believed that it was time to take his experiments to the sea, and that meant upscaling his experiments and proving the validity of his theory of saturation diving. And the first vessel to conduct this experiment would be called SeaLab. SeaLab I was a 40-foot cylindrical underwater habitat equipped with hot plates, electrical heaters, bunks, 4 viewing ports, and an intercom system. The mission was to see if the 4 volunteers could survive 21 days, 200 feet below the surface of the water, just off the coast of Bermuda, and come in and out of SeaLab, swimming outside of the vessel and then returning safely again. Scott Carpenter, an astronaut and the second American to orbit the Earth, had volunteered to be the 5th man on this mission, but unfortunately broke his arm a few days before the experiment, and so he had to pull out of the dive. The men would use the same gas mixture as the Genesis project, and the mission would be led by Dr. Bond, who is now known affectionately as Papa Topside. On July 19, 1964, SeaLab I was lowered to the floor of the ocean, and the 4 aquanauts, as they were now known, rowed down to SeaLab in a diving bell. The men left the bell and swam into SeaLab, their squeaky voices from the helium in the gas mixture announcing their arrival on the intercom system. The pressure from inside the vessel allowed the men to come and go through a hatch at the bottom of SeaLab. The helium in the air kept the men warm, but there was not enough oxygen in the mixture for them to strike a match. Bob Barth, one of the aquanauts, said it was like living in an aquarium. SeaLab I also worked with new breathing systems, including a way of expelling the carbon dioxide that the aquanauts exhaled with every breath. However, after 10 days down there, a hurricane forced Bond to cut the experiment short. And after a 55-hour decompression, all of the aquanauts emerged safe and sound. SeaLab I was considered to be a success, and saturation diving was proven to be feasible. However, Bond wasn't ready to let it go at that, and nor was the US Navy.
But now, it is a year later, and men are ready to extend the limits if they can. Here another adventure is in the readying stage, another exploration into that hostile alien place we call the sea.
SeaLab II, again led by Papa Topside, had a budget of 10 times the original SeaLab. Everything about it was bigger. It was nearly twice as large as the original SeaLab. It had a built-in toilet, lab equipment, 11 viewing ports, and a hot shower. And this time, 3 teams of aquanauts, 28 guys total, would each do 15 days straight at more than 200 feet below sea level. This time, SeaLab II would be lowered off the coast of San Diego, where the water was almost totally black and much colder than it was in Bermuda. On a good day, the aquanauts would only have 5 to 6 feet of visibility, and part of the test was to see how the divers could get in and out of SeaLab within this limited visibility and go even further down, an additional 300 feet while diving, and then return back to SeaLab. The Navy also tasked the aquanauts with setting up weather systems and also retrieving sunken fuselage from a fighter jet. They even gave them a trained dolphin. Meet Tuffy, you guys, to help ferry supplies to and from SeaLab, help deliver tools, and even bring the mail. To be honest though, Tuffy only did what he was supposed to do like half the time, but still. The Navy gave them a dolphin. This thing was really stepping up a notch. Plus, Scott Carpenter, the astronaut, was back and recovered from his broken arm, and he was not missing out on SeaLab Round 2. So, on August 28, 1965, the first team of divers arrived in SeaLab II. And from the get-go, it was pretty tough. The voice communication went in and out constantly, much as it had done in the original SeaLab. However, this time, lights would frequently burn out, lines would become tangled, and the aquanauts had to contend with a new foe that they hadn't met in Bermuda: scorpionfish. And apparently their sting causes quite a bit of pain and swelling and would put the aquanauts out of commission for a few days. And Scott Carpenter, unfortunately, was one of the aquanauts who got stung. Man, that guy can't catch a break. However, SeaLab II had received such positive press that he actually received a call from then President Lyndon B. Johnson while he was down there. So maybe that helped? Also, when SeaLab II landed on the ocean floor, it didn't land quite flat. It was kind of canted at an angle, so the aquanauts would refer to it as the Tilton Hilton. But basically, these guys spent the next month and a half waking up to reveille at 0700 and spending the whole day working on projects and experiments and trying not to get stung by scorpionfish, and then going to bed at taps at 2200, and then starting the cycle all over again. On October 11th, 1965, SeaLab II was raised to the surface. It was manned continuously for 45 days, and Carpenter stayed the longest at 30 days. The entire SeaLab II team was awarded the Navy Unit Commendation, which was the first time it was given to a mixed military and civilian scientific team.
Here at the San Francisco Bay Naval Shipyard, workers prepare SeaLab III, a special habitat for ocean floor dwelling, to be used by the aquanauts of the Navy's most ambitious undersea experiment to date. Already used in SeaLab II, major modifications to the cylindrical habitat were the addition of 2 rooms to the ends of the central section and an anchor ballast tank which would allow the habitat to remain level on the sloping ocean floor.
A lot of naval research funding was constrained during the Vietnam War, so it took George Bond nearly 4 years to continue with his experiments and launch SeaLab III. SeaLab III was even roomier than SeaLab II, and this time it would rest at 600 feet, more than 3 times the depth of SeaLab II, beneath the surface off the coast of San Clemente, California. And the 5 teams of 9 aquanauts would stay there for a collective 2 months. They would also conduct experiments on salvage techniques and complete oceanographic studies. This increase in depth below sea level was a huge leap and was dictated to Bond by the Navy. The aquanauts had to complete even more extensive diving training, which was done in a special hyperbaric chamber in the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And Scott Carpenter this time was acting as an advisor to the aquanauts. On February 5th, 1969, SeaLab III was lowered off the coast of San Clemente, California, and almost immediately, Bond knew they had a problem. There were a lot of bubbles coming out of SeaLab. Helium was escaping out of multiple spots in the vessel and bubbling out. The Navy had not pressure tested the lab with helium, and these leaks had to be filled, or the aquanauts would run out of helium and they would have to abandon SeaLab III. The decision was made to send down the first team of aquanauts early to fix the leak from the inside. 4 of them quickly descended into a diving bell, which had not been preheated because they didn't realize that they were going to use it so quickly. So it took them an hour to get down there, and the men were near frozen by the time they did. The water around them was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. However, they thought they would be able to quickly get into SeaLab, fix the leaks, and start warming up. But they were unable to get the hatch of SeaLab open. No matter what they did, the hatch wouldn't budge, so the helium continued to leak out of SeaLab, and the 4 men had to make their way back into the freezing diving bell and head back to the surface. And they were basically popsicles when they arrived. However, they were popsicles with the same problem. Helium was still leaking out of SeaLab III, and if it wasn't stopped, the whole expedition would be called off. After 4 hours, a decision had to be made. Scott Carpenter voted that the men not go back down a second time, but ultimately it was decided that they would, and the men headed back into the diving bell and headed back down to SeaLab. And it was just as cold this second go around. Upon arrival, 2 of the aquanauts, Bob Barth and Barry Cannon, left the bell and swam to the hatch. They could see that the helium leaks were coming from where the power cables connected to the lab itself. Cannon was working on the leaks, and Barth went to try the hatch again. But suddenly all the divers heard a scream underwater, and Barth saw Cannon convulsing, his jaw locked shut and his gas regulator out of his mouth and floating. Barth grabbed his buddy breather and tried to force it into Cannon's mouth, but they couldn't. George Bond and the rest of the crew on the surface could see all of this due to the CCTV they had pointed at SeaLab, and he even sent another diver down to help. Barth and the other aquanauts got Bannon back into the diving bell and started to make their way slowly back up to the surface, but unfortunately, it was too late. Barry Cannon could not be revived and passed away. He was 33 years old. Immediately, the Navy suspended SeaLab III, and a week later, the surviving aquanauts surfaced after their decompression, but Cannon's funeral had already been held. A month-long investigation found that carbon dioxide poisoning caused Cannon's death, and it was found that his rebreather was missing baralyme, a chemical necessary to remove carbon dioxide. Surgeon Commander John Rawlins, a Royal Navy medical officer assigned to the project, also suggested that hypothermia during the dive was a contributing factor. And things got even stranger later when apparently someone tried to sabotage the air supply of the remaining aquanauts as they were going through their decompression. A guard had to be posted at the decompression chamber, but it's unclear if this had anything to do with Cannon's death. The Navy officially ruled his death an accident. With Cannon's death and the escalation of the Vietnam War, SeaLab was completely shut down, and SeaLab III was eventually scrapped. However, Bond's vision of people living underwater did not die with SeaLab. Saturation diving became commonly used in the private sector and governments for a variety of purposes. It opened up new ways of working in the ocean, and some of these new experts in saturation diving became experts in covert operations working on US submarines. In 1972, the Hali-don, a US submarine, infiltrated Russian waters and located a cable that saturation divers attached a listening device to. This intercepted Soviet nuclear transmissions, and this was considered one of the highest points in covert intelligence for the US Navy at the time. And private sectors began using saturation divers not only to complete oceanographic studies, but also the oil and gas industry used saturation divers living in underwater vessels to complete repairs on wells, rigs, and pipelines. They are down there today, sometimes spending as much as 2 months underwater. In the 1980s, NOAA created an undersea station, the Aquarius, a habitat that is still in operation just off the Florida Keys. It supports one of the longest running and detailed coral reef monitoring programs in the world. And this program provides valuable information to manage and protect this ecosystem. The ability to spend longer underwater makes a huge difference in oceanography, and saturation diving allows for that. And none of that would have been possible without the work of George Bond and SeaLab. So I think the answer to the question is yes, human beings can live underwater. Saturation diving makes that possible. They can work, breathe, eat, drink, swim, do pretty much everything you do on the surface underwater.
Perhaps we will routinely send men to 800 feet soon, to 1,700 and more feet within some years, to live, to work, to study.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Would you spend a few months underwater? Does that sound like something remotely appealing? I don't know, I feel like I'd kind of be into it. I'm gonna need that trained dolphin though, definitely.